Rain streaked across the marble steps of Washington's courthouse, glistening under the glow of street lamps like veins of molten silver. The city seemed to hold its breath, aware of the confrontation about to unfold within its heart. Television, fans crowded the plaza, their satellite dishes tilted skyward. Reporters braced against the storm with umbrellas trembling in the wind. Every network teased the same headline: a high-profile legal showdown between a legend of the courtroom and a rising political force who had dared to challenge him. Inside a quiet chamber, Alan Dershowitz straightened his tie in front of a mirror. His hands were steady, though the faintest tremor hid in the curl of his jawline. He was a man who had stood at the epicenter of American legal wars for decades, a master of precedent, persuasion, and dominance. He knew how to crush opponents with the weight of history itself, and tonight he told himself would be no different. But his mind betrayed him with flashes of unease. This was not a former president on trial, nor a billionaire needing absolution. This was Jasmine Crockett, a name whispered with reverence by communities tired of being ignored, feared by colleagues who underestimated her sharpness until it was too late. She was younger, hungrier, and unafraid to set fire to sacred idols. She would not bow, and he knew it. Across town, Jasmine sat in a quiet car as it crawled toward the courthouse. Her phone buzzed endlessly, texts from supporters, warnings from friends, pleas from colleagues to be careful. She silenced it and gazed out the window. Washington's skyline blurred in the rain, monuments standing like indifferent witnesses to the struggles of the living. She breathed deeply, steadying herself, not for Dershowitz but for the institution he represented. Tonight was not about winning a case. It was about tearing away the illusion that power was synonymous with wisdom, that experience always equaled truth. As her car door opened, cameras flashed wildly. She emerged not with the guarded stride of a politician, but with the unflinching walk of someone stepping into history. A protester shouted her name, another lifted a sign. Justice is not inherited, it's fought for. She felt the weight of those eyes upon her, the hopes of people who believed she could stand against a man whose shadow had loomed over American law for half a century. Inside the courthouse, the gallery buzzed with expectation. The air felt thick, like the moment before thunder splits the sky. Dershowitz entered first, radiating the confidence of a man accustomed to command. Jasmine followed, her eyes scanning the chamber, calm but alive with fire. This was not just a legal contest. It was a generational reckoning, a collision of worlds. And everyone present could feel it. Before the first word was spoken, before the gavel struck, the storm had already gathered. The courthouse doors groaned open as a tide of voices and camera shutters poured into the marble-floored chamber. The gallery was already packed, rows of reporters clutching pens like weapons, ordinary citizens who had waded through the rain just to catch a glimpse, and a scattering of lobbyists and political aides who smelled opportunity in the air. The room itself, austere and imposing, seemed to lean in on its occupants, its high ceilings and heavy drapes demanding silence, demanding reverence. Alan Dershowitz entered first, escorted by his assistants who carried files like shields. He walked with the calm assurance of someone who had rehearsed this moment his entire life. Every step seemed to say, "I have been here before, and I will not be undone now." He adjusted his glasses as though to sharpen the field of battle, and for an instant the cameras framed him in a halo of flashbulbs, a living relic of legal history. Whispers slithered across the rows as he took his seat. The professor, the constitutional giant, the man who never loses. His presence was more than physical, it was myth made flesh, but even myth trembles when challenged. The doors opened again and Jasmine Crockett stepped through. The room shifted. She wore no armor but her certainty, no halo but the gaze of those who had waited years to see someone like her in this place. Her stride was measured, deliberate. She carried a single binder, not the mountain of case law her opponent had brought. She looked less like someone entering a duel, and more like someone arriving to tell the truth. The contrast was stark, cinematic, in its simplicity. Where Dershowitz seemed to float on the weight of precedent, Crockett seemed to cut through it with the sharp edge of conviction. She did not glance at him as she passed. Instead, her eyes swept the gallery, the students clutching notepads, the mothers with weary faces, the young activists who had forced their way past the rain. Her nod was subtle, but it was seen. The judge entered last, his black robes swaying like heavy curtains. He scanned the chamber with a look that balanced fatigue and severity, the eyes of a man who knew this hearing was not just another case. With a bang of the gavel, he reminded the crowd that order must prevail. But beneath his tone lingered something else, a recognition that history had slipped quietly into his courtroom, and history never left unchanged. As silence settled, the cameras rolled, pens readied, hearts quickened. The arena was set, the players in place, and though no arguments had yet been spoken, the first clash had already begun. In the way they walked, the way they breathed, the way their very presence carved the room into two worlds. The chamber held its silence like a fragile secret. Beyond, the oak-paneled walls, Washington hummed with its endless machinery of power. But inside, time seemed to slow. The stakes were whispered, never spoken aloud, as if naming them too clearly might shatter the air. This was not simply a case about technicalities, not a skirmish over footnotes of law. It was about influence itself, about whether those who had long bent the Constitution to serve the powerful could still silence the voices rising against them. In the gallery, aides murmured to one another in fragments: precedent on disclosure, a constitutional immunity, national implications. But their eyes betrayed them. They weren't only watching for rulings, they were watching for moments, the kind of moments that live longer than verdicts, that shape careers, movements, even nations. Dershowitz leaned back in his chair, expression carved in marble. His hands tapped rhythmically against his legal pad, a subtle signal of control. To him, this was ritual. He had faced senators, prosecutors, even presidents. What was one congresswoman from Texas to a man who had argued at the Supreme Court and outwitted the fiercest minds of his age? Yet beneath his calm exterior, an irritation flickered. She was not cowering. She was not shifting in her seat. She sat poised, spine straight, gaze unbroken, as if daring him to misstep. Jasmine Crockett felt that gaze. She could almost hear the thoughts behind it. She is too young, too bold, too certain. She let the thought pass like smoke. For years, she had heard variations of the same dismissal, from judges who underestimated her, from colleagues who mocked her cadence, from pundits who claimed her passion made her less credible. And every time, she had answered not with anger but with precision. Tonight would be no different. The judge shuffled papers with weary solemnity. "Counsel," he began, "you are both aware of the magnitude this hearing carries. The precedent, it may said, is of concern not only to this court, but to the nation." His voice faltered on the word nation, as though the gravity of it sat heavy on his tongue. He glanced toward Dershowitz, then to Crockett, acknowledging, without admitting, that this was more than litigation. It was theater, it was philosophy, it was war. For a long breath, silence reclaimed the room. Crockett's eyes flicked toward Dershowitz. He met them, steel against fire. No words passed, yet a conversation filled the space between them. "I have the weight of history, and I have the weight of tomorrow." The gavel came down once more, sharp and final. The duel was ready to begin, the quiet before the storm had ended. The first words belonged to Dershowitz. They almost always did. He rose slowly, deliberately, as if to remind the room that his voice was not one among many, but the one that defined the stage. Adjusting his jacket, he looked not at the judge, nor even at his notes, but directly at Jasmine Crockett, as though to erase the distance between them. His voice, low at first, carried the cadence of a man who had spent decades commanding courtrooms and lecture halls alike. "Your Honor," he began, the words laced with gravitas, "we stand here today not merely to argue a point of law, but to protect the very integrity of this institution. I have spent a lifetime studying, defending, and yes, sometimes bending the Constitution. I know its fragility, its resilience, and its limits. And I know, his eyes flicked again to Crockett, that passion without grounding in precedent can be as dangerous as indifference. A murmur rippled through the gallery. It was subtle but unmistakable. His opening was not simply legal, it was personal. He was not challenging her argument. He was challenging her very right to be here. He, continued, voice gaining strength, what we must reject is the temptation to allow theatrics to replace jurisprudence, to allow political ambition to masquerade as constitutional interpretation. I caution this court against being seduced by novelty when the wisdom of centuries lies before us. The law is not a stage for fiery speeches. It is a cathedral built on precedent, brick by brick, ruling by ruling. To discard that is to discard the very foundation upon which our freedoms rest. He paced, slow and measured, every movement designed to remind the chamber of his authority. Congresswoman Crockett, he said finally, breaking formality to address her directly, is undoubtedly intelligent. But intelligence is not experience, and conviction is not competence. His words fell like stones in water, rippling outward, drawing gasps and scribbles of pens from the reporters in the gallery. The judge shifted uneasily. This was argument, yes, but it was also provocation. Dershowitz pressed on. The law does not bend to zeal. It demands discipline. And though some may thrill at fiery rhetoric, it is the cold weight of precedent that must guide us. That is what I bring to this court today. Not noise, not spectacle, but history itself. For a moment, silence wrapped around the chamber. Dershowitz folded his arms behind his back, chin raised, as if he had already sealed the verdict. The cameras loved him, capturing his every pause, his every calculated gesture. To him, the battle was already half won. But across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett sat unmoved, her hands folded neatly atop her binder, eyes steady. To the untrained eye, she looked calm. To those who knew her, that calm was fire waiting for oxygen. The storm had made its first strike, and the air trembled with the charge of what was coming next. Jasmine Crockett rose with a calm that did not come from inexperience, but from the certainty of someone who had lived too long under the shadow of doubt. Her chair scraped softly against the polished floor as she stood, binder in hand, though she did not glance at it. She didn't need to. Every word she had prepared lived within her, stitched into memory by the weight of those who could not stand here themselves. The chamber felt suddenly smaller as her voice filled it, clear, unwavering, deliberate. Your Honor, she began, her tone respectful but edged with steel. I have listened carefully to Professor Dershowitz's argument. He speaks of precedent as though it is scripture, untouchable and eternal. But precedent by its very nature reflects not only the wisdom of the past but also its errors. To cite it without acknowledging its failures is not scholarship, it is willful blindness. Murmurs spread again through the gallery, some leaning forward, others scribbling furiously. She let the noise build for a moment, then continued, eyes never leaving the judge. Precedent once told us that women had no voice in the ballot box. Precedent once told us that human beings could be property. Precedent, Professor, is not a cathedral. It is a mirror, sometimes cracked, sometimes clouded. And it is our responsibility not merely to honor it, but to challenge it when justice demands. Dershowitz shifted in his seat. For the first time, his tapping fingers stilled. She turned then deliberately toward him. Professor Dershowitz argues that my conviction is noise, that my passion is spectacle. But I ask you, what is the purpose of law if not to serve the living, breathing people who rely on it for protection? Law without moral conscience is tyranny wrapped in Latin. Precedent without courage is nothing more than the repetition of old mistakes. The judge's brows lifted slightly, though his face remained unreadable. Crockett pressed forward. Experience is valuable, yes, but experience without humility becomes arrogance. It assumes that those who come after have nothing new to teach. It assumes that wisdom belongs only to those who have already spoken. But history shows us that change, real change, always begins with the voices that others dismissed as inexperienced, unqualified, or inconvenient. She paused then, letting silence fall, holding the moment. Reporters' pens hung in midair. A young woman in the gallery, no older than a law student, wiped her eyes discreetly. Crockett lowered her voice, steady and sharp. The professor has asked this court to trust him because of the weight of his years, the depth of his books, the strength of his reputation. But I ask this court to trust something else. Truth, when it stands before you. Justice when it calls from outside these walls. And the people. The millions of people who cannot afford to hire legends of the law to defend them, but who nonetheless deserve the same protection. Her gaze returned fully to the judge. I do not seek to discard the law. I seek to remind us why it exists. To ensure that power is not mistaken for virtue. To prove that precedent does not decide morality. Morality must decide precedent. A hush fell. Even the clicking of cameras seemed to pause. Then she did something unexpected. She closed her binder. Placing it on the table with finality, she rested her hands lightly on its cover as though to declare that she did not need the safety of notes. Not against this opponent. Not in this fight. Your Honor, she concluded, her voice swelling, with quiet conviction. Professor Dershowitz believes this is about him, his reputation, his legacy, his cathedral of precedent. But I am not here for any of that. I am here because justice is not a museum relic to be dusted and admired. It is a living thing, and it must answer to the present, not only the past. If the law cannot serve the people of today, then it is nothing but parchment and ink. She let the words hang in the air, not rushing to sit, not filling the silence. Her eyes lingered on Dershowitz just long enough to make it clear that the weight of her words was aimed at him, and then she turned back to the bench. For several long seconds, no one moved. The gallery sat transfixed. The judge's lips parted, as though he had forgotten the next step in the ritual. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett had already won something. Not the verdict, not yet, but the air itself. She had seized it, reshaped it, turned it into a force that pressed down on her opponent and lifted those who had always been told to keep quiet. Finally, she returned to her seat, calm once again, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But the room knew otherwise. History had felt the shift, and Alan Dershowitz, for all his composure, felt it too. Outside the courthouse, the storm had broken into chaos of its own kind. Rain-slicked streets glimmered beneath the red glow of camera lights, and the press line had swollen into something closer to a mob. Reporters jostled against barricades, umbrellas colliding, microphones thrust forward like weapons of urgency. The instant Jasmine Crockett's words reached the public feed, they ignited. Clips cut mid-sentence. Precedent without courage is nothing more than the repetition of old mistakes, spread across phones, televisions, and scrolling tickers. In one network studio, a commentator leaned toward the camera with an incredulous smile. Ladies and gentlemen, you just witnessed a masterclass. Crockett didn't just counter Dershowitz, she reframed the debate. She's not arguing law versus law, she's arguing law versus justice. And that, he jabbed a finger against his desk, is what resonates with people. On the courthouse steps, protesters erupted as the live stream played on their phones. Chants rose above the rain, echoing against stone. Justice is not parchment. Morality decides precedent. Placards blurred in the downpour, their ink running, but their message burning brighter. Some had come simply out of frustration with the system, others because they recognized in her words something they had long felt but never heard spoken with such force. Dershowitz's team huddled under umbrellas nearby, exchanging nervous glances. They watched with growing unease how quickly public sentiment was shifting. A single rebuttal, not even an hour into proceedings, had rewritten the narrative. The man who once controlled the oxygen of the room now found himself suffocating, outside it. In a bar not far from the courthouse, televisions flickered over a crowd of office workers and students. Crockett's image filled the screen, her words replayed again and again. Conversations hushed each time. One student whispered, "She sounds like she's talking to us." Not to him, not even to the judge, to us. Another, older patron shook, his head in disbelief. You don't go toe-to-toe with Dershowitz and come out standing taller, not unless you've got something bigger than law on your side. Meanwhile, on late-night feeds, her speech was already trending. Clips spliced with historic footage of suffragettes and civil rights leaders painted her as the latest in a lineage of defiant voices. Hashtags multiplied. Crockett vs. Dershowitz. Justice lives, morality decides. Inside the courthouse lobby, reporters cornered staffers rushing between hearings. Did you hear her speech? Do you think Dershowitz underestimated her? The staffers muttered evasions, but even their eyes betrayed fascination. And then came the analysis. The talk shows and panels convened in real time, anchors urging caution while their guests threw gasoline on the fire. Some argued she was grandstanding, appealing to emotion. Others insisted that was the point, that emotion was the part of law most often suppressed, and she had just reminded the nation of its absence. By nightfall, headlines crystallized: Dershowitz confronted by rising star. Crockett's rebuttal reverberates nationwide. Old guard meets new fire, but perhaps the most telling image was one that went viral on its own. A single still frame of Crockett, binder closed, hands calm, eyes unflinching. No caption needed. It was the kind of image that outlived news cycles, that entered posters and murals, that turned a moment into a movement. Back inside the courtroom, the proceedings ticked on, but the balance had shifted. What was said in the chamber no longer belonged only to those within it. It belonged to the world, echoing in chants outside, headlines above, and screens everywhere. For Alan Dershowitz, the battle was no longer against a woman across the aisle. It was against a tide he could not control. The courtroom had become restless. The gallery shifted in their seats, the air vibrating with the aftershock of Crockett's words, their echoes carried back inside from chants outside the courthouse. Even the reporters, usually disciplined in their neutrality, leaned forward with open anticipation, pens poised like daggers waiting for the next thrust. The noise wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a current threatening to sweep away the decorum of the court. The judge, a man of decades on the bench, had seen passion flood his chambers before, but never like this. He tapped the gavel once, not with full force, but a warning. The room stilled, though the tension remained thick. His voice, gravelly yet measured, broke the silence. "This is a court of law," he said, his tone firm, carrying the weight of someone trying to anchor a ship in a rising storm. Not a theater, not a stage for competing narratives. What is argued here must be grounded in law, not in spectacle. His eyes lingered on Crockett, but only for a moment, before turning toward Dershowitz. The professor sat with arms folded, chin high, though the faint crease in his forehead betrayed his irritation. Crockett, by contrast, bowed her head slightly in acknowledgement, her composure radiating both respect and defiance. She understood the implication that her words, though powerful, had unsettled the delicate balance the court demanded. But the judge wasn't finished. That being said, he continued, softening only slightly, this court is not blind to the historical significance of these proceedings. What is argued here will be read, studied, and judged far beyond this room. And while I will not allow disorder, I will also not pretend that this case is anything less than monumental. The statement hung in the air, a rare admission from the bench. The gallery stirred again, sensing what the judge himself could not fully contain, that this hearing had already transcended its boundaries. Dershowitz shifted forward, seizing the moment. "Your Honor," he said, his voice deliberate, "with respect, we must guard this institution from being hijacked by rhetoric. The law is not about feelings, it is about precedent. Allowing speeches that conflate morality with legal authority risks eroding the very fabric of justice." The judge's eyes narrowed, irritation flickering. "And yet, Professor, you of all people should recall that morality and legality have never been so neatly divided. Brown vs. Board, Loving vs. Virginia, Gideon vs. Wainwright, all were argued on principles that transcended technical precedent. Justice does not live in footnotes alone." A ripple moved through the gallery like a suppressed gasp. The judge had not sided with Crockett, not outright, but he had reminded the professor that the court's memory extended beyond his narrative. Crockett raised her eyes, catching the judge's gaze briefly. It was not triumph she felt, not yet, but validation, an acknowledgement that her words had landed, not as noise, but as something the bench itself could not ignore. The gavel struck again. "Both counsel," the judge said firmly, "remember why you are here. This court will not be reduced to theater, but neither will it deny the gravity of this case. Proceed." Silence followed, dense and electric. The storm outside roared faintly through the courthouse walls, chants muffled but persistent. Inside, the battle lines were redrawn, not just between Crockett and Dershowitz, but between an old order and the possibility of something new. The judge leaned back in his chair, eyes heavy with the knowledge that he was presiding over something larger than himself. The trial had become more than law. It had become history. Alan Dershowitz could feel the ground shifting beneath him, though he would never admit it aloud. The gallery's reaction, the judge's subtle acknowledgement, the storm of Crockett's words reverberating outside, it all gnawed at him. He had been here before, of course, in countless courts and on countless stages. He had outlasted presidents and prosecutors, pundits and politicians. He had been the immovable object, the voice of the law when others stumbled into theatrics. Yet tonight, something felt different. He leaned forward, fingers pressed against the wood of the lectern, eyes narrowing on the judge before cutting sideways toward Crockett. His tone, measured but edged with iron, filled the chamber once more. "Your Honor, I have practiced law longer than Congresswoman Crockett has been alive. I have argued before the highest courts in this nation, defended the Constitution when it was most under siege, and taught generations of lawyers what it means to serve justice. And yet, today, we are asked to treat political rhetoric as though it carries the same weight as constitutional reasoning." He paused deliberately, his voice dropping into a lower register, meant to strike like a blade. "With all due respect, this is not a rally. This is not a town hall. And this chamber cannot afford to confuse eloquence for authority." The word stung, sharp and personal. Crockett's jaw tightened, though she did not look away. Dershowitz pressed further, his voice rising now, more forceful, abandoning the calm superiority he had entered with. "Congresswoman Crockett speaks of morality as though it alone can govern a nation. But morality without structure is chaos. Passion without principle is anarchy. And while I commend her for her enthusiasm, enthusiasm is not jurisprudence," the gallery murmured. Reporters scribbled furiously, some raising eyebrows at the thinly veiled condescension. Still, Dershowitz fed the silence with more. "She suggests that precedent is flawed, that history itself is a burden to be cast aside. But let us remember, without precedent there is no stability. Without continuity there is no constitution. We cannot afford to let each generation discard the wisdom of the one before it simply because it hungers for novelty. This chamber must ask itself, do we want a government of laws or a government of impulses?" He took a breath, eyes burning now with a sharper fire. His tone shifted darker. "Congresswoman Crockett has made this about herself, her conviction, her fire, her narrative of resistance. But I put it to the court. Since when does personal conviction grant authority over constitutional law? Since when does passion outweigh experience? If this chamber accepts her reasoning, it will signal that the foundations of justice are open to demolition, brick by brick, each time someone with a microphone feels inspired." Gasps moved through the audience. The cruelty in his phrasing was not subtle, it was calculated. A dismissal of her legitimacy, a branding of her as reckless and naive. Crockett inhaled slowly, her hands resting flat against the table, resisting the urge to respond too soon. She let him go on. Dershowitz leaned closer toward the bench, almost as if confiding. "We must also address integrity. It is no secret that the Congresswoman has political ambitions. Her presence here, her rhetoric. This is not about constitutional purity. It is about spectacle. It is about building a brand, not defending the law. And the danger, Your Honor, is that this chamber risks becoming a stage for political theater, where the loudest voice drowns out the most reasoned one. The blow was direct, personal. The gallery stirred uneasily. Even some reporters shifted in their seats. This was no longer just argument, it was attack. Dershowitz straightened, voice booming now, filling every corner of the chamber. This court should not and must not reward zealotry over discipline. It must not allow emotion to cloud reason, because once it does, Your Honor, there will be no turning back. The law will cease to be law. It will be nothing more than performance. Let the words hang heavy and suffocating. He folded his arms, chin raised, certain that the sting of his attack would land, that Crockett's fire would flicker out under the weight of his authority. But something unexpected happened. The room did not fall into silence out of reverence. It fell into silence because the cruelty had been felt too keenly. The attacks, once cloaked in legal reasoning, now hung bare, exposed for what they were, an attempt to belittle, to shame, to strip legitimacy.